table at the back of the room, and there's still plenty of spaces. So please, if you want to do that, just sign your name on one of the sheets at the back of the room. I'm very pleased to introduce to you, you probably don't need to be introduced because Louise has already been up on the stage, Louise Doughty, our next author, who is not just a novelist, but also a critic and has wrote a terrific column about how to write a novel, and which was full of sort of warnings, but some constructive advice as well. And Louise, you studied creative writing yourself once upon a time,
I
didn't you?
did. I did the MA in creative writing with Malcolm Bradbury at University of East Anglia back in the a very long time ago. I was taught by Malcolm Bradbury, and I had the last year of Angela Carter, the last year that she was teaching. And my fellow students were people like Anne Enright, Glenn Patterson was in the year before, Toby, who's, I don't know whether he's made it this morning, but Toby's also, I mean, that course has really got an extraordinary kind of roll call now. But I was very lucky because I went in the very early days. It was just before Ishiguro got the Booker Prize for Remains of the Day, which I think was the point at which the course suddenly started going. And now, of course, it's very big, and I think it's quite a hothouse. You know, agents go up there while the students are still on the course. Whereas when I went, it was just sitting in a bar with Malcolm Bradbury. Well, it was fantastic.
Indeed. I read some of Louise's columns, and rather incautiously, the first of the columns, having learnt creative writing, now teaches it, promulgates it, some would say, and incautiously in her first column on, which became the book, a novel in a year, she said, she actually told everybody that she said the opposite of what novelists usually say. They usually say, oh, it's terrible, being a novelist is terrible. It's like climbing Everest with a shark on your back. It's the worst kind of job. Become an accountant. No, no, no. Because, of course, they don't want any more competition. But actually, Louise very honestly did the opposite. She said the cafe talk, the book launches, the scanning of the literary pages, feeling guiltily gratified when a friend gets a bad review. Being a writer is great fun. I think the guiltily is a very guilty insertion, that adverb, guiltily gratified. Why not just gratified? But anyway, so she advertised what a lovely career it was, and has therefore become a kind of role model, I fear, for lots and lots of...
But also deeply unpopular with some of my novel-writing peers,
yes,
who think it's very wrong of me to be encouraging them. In fact, Margaret Atwood said to me at the Edinburgh Festival when I was telling her about Novel in a Year, she said, darling, she said, you shouldn't be encouraging them, we should be drowning them like kittens. But it was a very rainy year at Edinburgh. I thought if any aspiring writers are found face down in the mud, it would have been Margaret Atwood's hand to press them down.
Well, Louise is about to do a little reading from Dickens. Before she does, I should say, we're going to talk about a bit later about a novel of hers, Stone Cradle, and I should advertise that her novel... Whatever You Love is
Whatever You Love is the English title.
The English title.
Don't ask me to pronounce the German.
Okay. Was du liebst gehört dir nicht. Yeah? Is being published auf Deutsch in when? By Bertelsmann.
April.
Yeah?
April.
Okay. So, yes, Louise, she's being an author, being a novelist, she sent me, like the others, her reading from David Copperfield in advance, which I prepared some ingenious responses to, and of course told me over breakfast that there'd been a change of mind because she's so creative, and she's going to read from a different bit now. But,
I think it's John that's going to start drowning us like kittens soon. I think he's had enough.
I did say my students aren't actually allowed to do this sort of thing, but anyway, go on then.
Short expostulation over breakfast along the lines of, you lot were students, you'd never get away with this. Anyway, it's only a page or so later than the reading I suggested. So yeah, it's from the opening of David Copperfield. And really just to sort of set up the whole idea of Dickens and being a contemporary writer, it was very interesting when I was asked to come on this conference. It was, of course, irresistibly grandiose, the idea that I would be standing up and talking about Dickens's influence on me. And I've been telling everybody that ever since I was invited here. Oh yes, I'm off to Berlin to talk about how Dickens has influenced me. And actually, I just thought I was being idiotic about this, because when I was asked, okay, is it confession time? I know it's early in the morning. I actually hadn't read any Dickens for about 20 years.
Oh, shada.
Like the others, I'd read a lot at school and obviously university. And then I'd just, moved on. And as a contemporary novelist, I believe in reading my peers. I read a lot of contemporary fiction. And so when I got the email from Anna saying, and also, you can talk about links between Dickens and your own work, I thought, oh, crikey, I'm going to have to make that bit up. Because I didn't believe that Dickens had influenced me at all. I thought, well, 19th century novelist and, 21st century novelist. And then I went back and reread some of the Dickens novels, and it was really, really spooky, because I kept seeing things which I would never have thought were uppermost in my mind when I was writing, in particular Stone Cradle, which is the most obviously Dickensian, I think, of my books. But even the others, I kept seeing things, and you realise how much, as a writer, how much you've absorbed, almost by osmosis, from your very early reading. Books where you've completely forgotten maybe even the fact of reading it, but something has been fed in. And actually, rereading, I went to the first-person narratives, Great Expectations, and David Copperfield, the big sort of autobiographical books. And then rereading Stone Cradle and thinking, my God, there were all sorts of things that you pick up without realising it. David Copperfield, as I'm sure you all know, Dickens said was his favourite child. All parents have a favourite, and my favourite is David Copperfield. And of course, if you've read Claire's wonderful biography and then you read David Copperfield as well, you can just see there's so much in it from Dickens' early life. I think what it's got in common with so many, not just the first-person novels, but this kind of heartbreaking sympathy for the powerlessness of children. And it's clearly something that Dickens never forgot his whole life. And I think we were talking, about why he survived so well yesterday. And that, to me, goes to the heart of it, really, because whatever background we're from, whatever kind of lives we've all had those moments when we've been treated unfairly by an adult, where we've been undermined, and it doesn't have to be beating. It can be something very small and a very cutting remark. But we can all remember that acutely. I think those moments live with us for the rest of our lives. And the way in which Dickens, in all his novels, was so on the side of the child. And of course, the wonderful thing about first-person narratives, particularly when people are talking about narrating their own lives as a child, is the conceit is always that they are doing it from an adult perspective. So when Dickens has David Copperfield on his way to the sort of awful school, and he's stopping at the inn, and the waiter is giving him the ale, and then promptly tells him that the ale is actually known to be poisonous, but he, the waiter, will do him the great favour of drinking it for him, and that actually the one thing that will counter the poisonous effect of the ale is a chop, and so the waiter will have one of his chops to counter the poisonous. And this story is told very innocently from David Copperfield's point of view, but obviously we know what's going on as adult readers, and the narrator of the novel is an adult David Copperfield who also knows what's going on. And I think that's what fascinates me about first-person novels, is there's all these different layers of conceit. And for those of you foolish enough to come to my workshop this afternoon, we'll be talking more about this, and you will in fact be writing your own. You have been warned. So I'm just going to read. I'm going to read from my Kindle. I'm hoping that this is something that Dickens would have approved of. Of course, if the battery runs out halfway through, then I shall just look like a plank. But I will make an attempt to read from the Kindle. Is this the first time anyone's read from a Kindle on this? I think it is, isn't it? Certainly at this conference, anyway.
So cutting edge.
I am so cutting edge. You're getting a bit bitter now, John. It's only the first session on day 2, You've just got to hang on for the rest of the day. So this is the very, very early stages of David Copperfield. I was born at Blunderstone in Suffolk, or thereby, as they say in Scotland.
I was a posthumous child. My father's eyes had closed upon the light of this world 6 months when mine opened upon it. There is something strange to me, even now, in the reflection that he never saw me, and something stranger yet in the shadowy remembrance that I have of my first childish associations with his white gravestone in the churchyard, and of the indefinable compassion I used to feel for it, lying out alone there in the dark night, when our little parlour was warm and bright with fire and candle, and the doors of our house were, almost cruelly, it seemed to me sometimes, bolted and locked against it. An aunt of my father's, and consequently a great-aunt of mine, of whom I shall have more to relate by and by, was the principal magnet of our family. Miss Trotwood, or Miss Betsy, as my poor mother always called her, when she sufficiently overcame her dread of this formidable personage to mention her at all, which was seldom, had been married to a husband younger than herself, who was very handsome, except in the sense of the homely adage, handsome is that handsome does, for he was strongly suspected of having beaten Miss Betsy, and even of having once, on a disputed question of supplies, made some hasty but determined arrangements to throw her out of 2 pairs of stairs windows. These evidences of an incompatibility of temper induced Miss Betsy to pay him off and effected a separation by mutual consent. He went to India with his capital, and there, according to a wild legend in our family, he was once seen riding on an elephant in company with a baboon, but I think it must have been a baboo or a bagum. Anyhow, from India, tidings of his death reached home within 10 years. How they affected my aunt, nobody knew, for immediately upon the separation, she took her maiden name again, bought a cottage in a hamlet on the seacoast a long way off, established herself there as a single woman with 1 servant, and was understood to live in secluded, ever afterwards, in an inflexible retirement. My father had once been a favourite of hers, I believe, but she was mortally affronted by his marriage on the ground that my mother was a wax doll. She had never seen my mother, but she knew her to be not yet 20. My father and Miss Betsy never met again. He was double my mother's age when he married, and of but a delicate constitution. He died a year afterwards, and, as I have said, 6 months before I came into the world. This was the state of matters on the afternoon of what I may be excused for calling that eventful and important Friday. He's referring to the fact he's about to be born. I can make no claim, therefore, to have known at that time how matters stood, or to have any remembrance founded on the evidence of my own senses of what follows. My mother was sitting by the fire, but poorly in health and very low in spirits, looking at it through her tears and desponding heavily about herself and the fatherless little stranger who was already welcomed by some grocers of prophetic pins in a drawer upstairs to a world not at all excited on the subject of his arrival. My mother, I say, was sitting by the fire that bright, windy March afternoon, very timid and sad, and very doubtful of ever coming alive out of the trial that was before her, when, lifting her eyes as she dried them to the window opposite, she saw a strange lady coming up the garden. My mother had a sure foreboding at the second glance that it was Miss Betsy. The setting sun was glowing on the strange lady over the garden fence, and she came walking up to the door with a fell rigidity of figure and composure of countenance that could have belonged to nobody else. When she reached the house, she gave another proof of her identity. My father had often hinted that she seldom conducted herself like any ordinary Christian, and now, instead of ringing the bell, she came and looked in at that identical window, pressing the end of her nose against the glass, to the extent that, my poor dear mother used to say, it became perfectly flat and white in a moment. She gave my mother such a turn that I've always been convinced I am indebted to Miss Betsy for having been born on a Friday.
So why did you choose that, Louise?
I think what really interests me about it is that when you haven't read Dickens for a couple of decades and you look back, what you do remember is the vast third-person, multiple point of view narrative sprawl. You know, I thought about Bleak House, I thought about Hard Times, and when you actually go back to a book like David Copperfield, what strikes you is how modern the narrative tone seems. And, you know, contemporary novelists, we tend to think we invented all the tricks. And actually, of course, Dickens was doing it way back then. I mean, for instance, that little passage, one of the reasons I chose it is because he's narrating, as a first-person narrator, something that he couldn't have possibly seen, he couldn't have been present at. And he does it incredibly deftly. He just has one little line, I wasn't there, of course, and then goes on to describe in great detail the scene, how his mother felt, how, you know, Miss Trotwood behaved, and you suspend disbelief instantly. You accept it completely. You don't start reading that scene thinking, hang on a minute, he wasn't even there. One deft stroke, and that's it. And also the way in which he moves time forward, the way in which, I think Claire mentioned the foreshadowing we have. I mean, we think of foreshadowing, I think, as quite modern in some ways, but the point where little Emily is above the water, and he says, you know, if I had known what was going to happen to her, it would have been better if she'd fallen off in the water. I mean, that is absolutely classic, you know, dun, 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 now read on. And, of course, at the stage at which he wrote that, he probably hadn't decided little Emily's fate.
Do you think?
Well, it was the serial. It was the serial. I think he maybe he had, you know, he knew something horrible was going to happen to her, obviously, and he thought he might as well set it up. But I would doubt very much whether he had decided the details, even if...
Not sure about that.
You think that he would have known what he was going to happen to?
Yes. I think there was only one possible thing that could happen to little Emily that's kind of worse than death. Sort of thing.
Yes, that's true. And I suppose the whole conceit of her falling off into the sea is maybe a sort of metaphor for the fallen woman.
Well, it's funny thinking of the foreshadowing, because the bit that you read comes just after what I'm sure everybody come across David Copperfield will remember very well. Weird bit about the caul. David Copperfield born. He says he's born in a caul, which is a membrane. And in some very rare cases, children come out of the caul, and it's thought, isn't it, that was thought that the possessor of a caul would never drown. And there's a little sort of completely digressive, wonderfully wasteful paragraph, which I don't think is very modern, actually, which is sort of about how they advertise the caul and to sell it, and somebody offered a whole load of bottles of sherry, but the mum didn't drink sherry, so that was no good. So it ended up being offered in a local raffle or something, and an old lady bought it. Is this right?
Yeah.
I think
she wins
right.
the raffle. She has to pay 5 shillings.
Yeah, she has to pay 5 shillings for it, and she gets the caul, which guarantees that she'll never drown. But this old lady, one of her peculiarities is that she never ever goes on water. She's never been on water except to go on a bridge over a river. That's the nearest she's got. And she thinks going on water is immoral. And then there's a kind of little thing about how she drinks lots of tea, and it never occurs to her that actually that requires people to go on water. I mean, it's kind of, and you're thinking, I mean, it's so, I don't know what they'd say in a creative writing class, but he's off. And yet, of course, it's all about drowning, isn't it? And the book is about drownings, and has 2 drownings in it, and actually Dickens is obsessed with drownings, and he counts the drownings in Dickens, from Quilp in Old Curiosity Shop drowns, and Compeyson and Magwitch drown, and there's a paper in it, isn't there? Surely maybe it's been done. Drowning. So it's kind of, so I'm just thinking about the things which are sort of not very modern about it as well. It's got that foreboding stuff, but it's also got this odd, I call it wastefulness. I mean, can you imagine a sort of contemporary writer daring to do that in a way?
Well, they'd be told to make it shorter.
Yes.
I remember there's a great thing that Philip says when the Northern Clemency, on his very long books, I think about 800 pages, Dickensian length, and I remember him telling me that when he first delivered it, it was something like 1,400 pages. And he said he sent the email to his editor at his publisher saying, You know you're called an editor, well, now edit. And that his job is to bring it down. I think certainly the digressions, yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think in the modern novel they would be cut. I think also nowadays, I'm not sure, I think it would be harder to get through a novel or get a novel through the publishers where the story was the story of someone's life, in the sense that I think there's more pressure, I think, to have an external plot that has, if you like, external references, to say this is just one person's story. So to have a novel where the title is just the name of the person whose story it is. Although, I mean, not to say that there isn't plot in David Copperfield. I mean, there's plenty of it and lots happened. But I think there's more of a sense that we are expected to look out to the external world in a more obvious way and have a plot.
How do you say that's interesting? So just the story of a person's life in itself,
yes,
is not a good enough.
I
think the publishing company would sort of say, but what's the...
would want to know what's the wider relevance. They would want the person either to be an important person within society but the idea of just an ordinary man or woman and the story of their life, I think, I just have a feeling, I mean, we can't really speak on behalf of the publishing industry because I suppose it depends on how well it was written, but
that sounds that sounds rather sad, really, in a way, because, I don't know, in its origins, of course, novels did tell the stories of people's lives which were quite extraordinary stories, but that was the whole sort of, I don't know, before Dickens came along in the 18th century, that was the whole kind of beef of the novel, really. Here's a kind of interesting kind of book which all it does is it tells a story of a completely, you know, a servant. You know, lots of them are about, you know, really people of quite low origins.
Yes.
And it tells the story of their life. And of course it's got to be, they have to have been shipwrecked or sexually harassed by their master or something there, of course, but still, it's a story of their, or at least a chunk of their life, and that's good enough. And you think that's that sort of time-honoured convention of the 18th and 19th centuries is not...
let's just say I'm not aware of recent examples, but we'll probably come up with half a dozen by the end of the day, but I can't think of one offhand.
There's something else in your reading, just a little thing, that struck me as being peculiarly very Dickensian and very difficult to sort of imagine now, although maybe you could sort of get it in a Martin Amis novel or something, perhaps, which is the mixture of comedy and violence. Yeah. So actually Betsy Trotwood incautiously married this man younger than her who beat her up, you know, and we know that's not funny. It's just not funny. That is domestic violence. And that is one of our absolutely not funny topics, although it's a topic that novelists are very much drawn to. But in the Dickens, it's sort of quite funny, you know. I think evidence of an incompatibility. He says, threw her out of the window. This evidence of an incompatibility of temper. It's quite funny, you know.
But he thinks it's funny because of how formidable Betsy Trotwood is. And I think that's why he makes a joke of it. Because she frightens the life out of everybody else in the novel for most of the book. But yes, I mean, I think, we were having some of those discussions yesterday. There are enormous amounts of papers that have been written, I'm sure they have, about Dickens' view of women. And of course, he was he loved being the protective older man, particularly for very young women that he fell madly in love with. His empathy for womankind tended to end when they became older and or large, as we saw with his own wife. And also with Maria Beadnell, there's a wonderful thing where he was absolutely devastated when he was jilted by this woman when she was a young woman. And then after he becomes famous, she wrote to him and got in contact with him. And they had this very passionate exchange of letters, you know, I have always loved you type letters. I mean, a bit more subtle than that. But, and they arranged to meet. And she warned him in one of the letters. She said, I am become old and fat. And he still said, oh, but, you know, you've always been the great love of my life, in effect. And then he met her, and he was utterly horrified because she'd gone plump, like his own wife, and she was middle-aged like him. And that was not his idea of romantic love. His idea of romantic love was a child woman, a winsome 18-year-old. And I think he couldn't get rid of poor Maria fast enough. You know, he'd written her these long letters, sort of exciting her fantasies about the long-lost love. And once he met her, that was it. You know, he was off.
But Betsy Trotwood is quite. I mean, she's an elderly lady, but I mean, she's fantastic, isn't she? And she is. She's kind of, as they say, formidable. But gradually in the novel, you find that actually this early kind of screw-up marriage has sort of not left its mark. Yeah, left its mark. I mean, that it's formed her, and that you know, she has quite a complicated psychology. I think she's not a grotesque, is she? And I was just thinking, in a way, maybe it's that thing you read out about being thrown out of the window. I mean, it's funny, sort of. I don't think it's funny because we sort of laugh at Betsy Trotwood. It's that sort of thing of that you were talking about earlier. That sort of brilliant narrative thing he does, which he does in Great Expectations as well, of using a rather elaborate euphemistic vocabulary, looking back for something rather, something brutish, and that's quite a sort of. I suppose that is quite a kind of modern technique. That's something you must teach on your courses, isn't it?
Well, I think it's certainly true that whenever you tackle a difficult subject matter, you create an instant problem for yourself as a novelist, which is, how do I take matter which is grim or brutal or depressing or upsetting, and use this without making the work unreadable for the reader? I think it's very interesting that when you read non-fiction books about awful things happening, I mean, there's the big thing we've had in the UK, I don't know if it's happened in Germany, is what's called misery memoirs, of people writing about very, very desperate, often very abusive childhoods. And people saying, well, how do these things sell? I think the reason they sell is because the very act that you are reading a book written by the person who's been through this, you know that they survived. And they survived well enough to write a book. So however grim the material you're reading, you have that in your back of your mind. This child that I'm reading about being beaten or abused has survived well enough to write a book about it. So you know there's light at the end of the tunnel. And all those memoirs have light at the end of the tunnel, by and large. It's different with fiction, because it's not the narrative you're reading, you know the author could do absolutely anything to this person who's having a very difficult time. They might, at the end of the book, the conclusion might be this person never recovers and has an awful life. So in a way, I think it can be much more upsetting to read a fictional account, particularly if it's well written, of appalling events. And it's certainly a problem I had with Whatever You Love, which at the opening of the book, a woman's child has been killed in a hit-and-run accident. And, you know, there is a huge problem. How do you represent the reality of grief, this most appalling thing, the worst thing that can happen to anybody, and do that without making a novel completely unreadable? And Fires in the Dark, my fourth novel, was set during the Second World War. It had scenes in concentration camps. It was about the Romani Holocaust. Stone Cradle, the people live lives of, desperate poverty. And I think one way you do it, and I think Dickens obviously knew this incredibly well, considering how dark the lives is, you have to have moments of very, very black humour. And I think what he does so brilliantly is he does it in a way that doesn't undermine the sort of the human suffering. As you say, you can give a character like Betsy Trotwood a flash of sadness later on in the book, but your duty as a novelist is to keep people reading. It's not to upset them so much they just go, I can't handle that. And pulling that off, I think, is one of the trickiest balancing acts that a novelist has to perform.
Yeah, the Betsy Trotwood thing, the brilliant thing about it, I think, is, which I do think that a contemporary novelist might well botch, because we're so sort of used to, not just novelists, all of us, used to the idea that sort of, rather like the misery memoir things, people are scalded and formed by early traumas. And the brilliant thing about Betsy Trotwood, about that bit of information about her being beaten up by this, this guy then goes and rides elephants and dies in India, is that everything about her is totally kind of tough and unyielding. But actually, she made this really stupid mistake when she was young. And there's a kind of vein of ruefulness. It's not just sensitivity. She made a stupid mistake. So she goes around telling everybody else what they should do. But actually, from the beginning, and that she knows, she made the most stupid decision ever. And she's telling all these other people, that they're babies. And So, I mean, I just think that...
And also that wonderful moment about him dying in India, you know that every reader is going to go, yes, you know, that's what, you know. And it's all, you know, this husband appears briefly and then dies in India. But, you know, there is a sense of that, you know, the man got his just desserts and here is Betsy with her money and her...
Do you think, I mean, you're saying the difference between a misery memoir phenomenon is extraordinary. I don't know. Do you have misery memoirs in Germany? Is it? Yes, you do. God, it's worldwide. Oh, no. Thinking heck. But anyway, I mean, it is an extraordinary phenomenon. But you say the difference between the misery memoir and the novel is that you don't know what the novelist is going to do when you're reading the novel. I wonder with David Copperfield, I mean, I have read it a few times, but I haven't read it for probably about 4 or 5 years. Don't you, when you're reading David Copperfield, don't you sort of know that it's going to be okay? I mean, that he is going to...
I think you do with David Copperfield because it's Dickens and because it's a Victorian novel. I don't think you necessarily would with a contemporary novel.
No. No, you might think, oh, God, this Louise Doughty, she's going to kill her, anything could happen. But that is a difference, isn't it? Yes. I mean, I think that sort of, and we've talked a lot over yesterday about Great Expectations seems to be everybody's favourite. And one of the reasons, I mean, it's perhaps because it's the most perfect, but also it is the one which least gratifies the Victorian taste for the, you know, everybody at the end gets their portions. And that thing that Henry James is very disdainful of, that people get allocated their cash rewards, their wives, their punishments, whatever it be. And David Copperfield does end up, that's one of the most fantastic moments, I think, David Copperfield's right at the end. And David Copperfield, remember, his former schoolmaster, Mr. Creakle, has become, of course, a sort of magistrate and inspector of prisons. Of course, naturally, that's what he is. And he's absolutely shameless old villain and shows no embarrassment at all about seeing David again, who's become a reporter. And he goes with Traddles, doesn't he? He goes to see the prison. And they say, you know, it's a new model prison, and they're terribly proud of it, and it's a ghastly utilitarian sort of factory of souls, but they're all very proud of it. And they say, but we've got 2 prisoners who are absolutely model. They are the most, and they show you what we can do, and they're the evidence that this prison works. And you remember, and they go along and they say, whatever it is, prisoner 1103 comes out, and it's Uriah Heep. And he says, oh, I'm so grateful for being punished like this. Oh, that's really, really. and they say, oh, he's a model prisoner. And then some of them say, well, actually, I don't think he's as much. He says, well, what about the one next door? And it's prisoner 1104, and it comes out, and it's Littimer, the ghastly valet for Steerforth, to whom Steerforth was going to hand little Emily as a kind of sexual, I finished with her, you have her now. Littimer, who's the most horrible, sinister character in the whole of Dickens. Oh, I'm very, very grateful. Thank you very much for just being in prison is the best thing that's ever happened to me. It's so fantastic. And it's it's one of those absolutely audacious coincidences, because the logic of it is so perfect. But everybody's getting put in their right place. And
I think this is, I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about yesterday, as Dickens being seen as the kind of the great, you know, defender of sort of family values and something that's heartwarming. And I mean, there's no doubt he was under huge pressure to have, you know, redemptive endings where people got what they deserve. I mean, as you know, the sort of double ending to Great Expectations is incredibly important. And I mean, nowadays, as a modern reader, you can't read Great Expectations and believe there's the remotest chance of Estella ever loving anybody, and that even though she recognises something in Pip, she has had such a cold upbringing. I mean, just going back to Misery Memoir, she has known no human empathy, that you just know that this, you know, even if they do marry, they'll be straight down marriage counselling before you can say boo to goose, and she'll be a terrible mother to her own children too. But obviously that's, I mean, perhaps it goes back to what Toby was saying about Dickens being pre-Freud and pre-psychoanalysis and pre all these explanations. I think that, I mean, I don't think the Victorian audience would have been able to handle more ambiguity than he was allowed.
But do you think they're liberated in a way as well? Because it's very interesting what you say about, you know, that is a very contemporary sort of narrative account, which I absolutely recognise, of what we think will happen to people, probably if I've had a certain kind of upbringing. But I remember there's a moment in Great Expectations where Joe Gargery tells Pip about his upbringing. He had a terrible upbringing, and his father was remorselessly violent to him. But Joe is kind of clearly, I think in a way that even modern readers respond to and find not usually sentimental, or just enough this side of being sentimental to be quite moving. Joe is a good person. And I just wonder sometimes, if you feel this as a novelist, actually, that if we're a bit enslaved to an idea of psychological causation, where indeed somebody, that kind of upbringing would lead to that kind of person. We know that, we've seen the TV programs, we've read the newspaper articles, we're wise, you know. And Dickens was innocent, and he thought somebody could be brutalised and then become good. You know, but why not?
I think we are enslaved to it slightly. I think also we're enslaved to the idea that our novels must be sort of realistic in inverted commas. And of course, what realistic is, what realistic means, is very much open to debate. But it's that idea of the sort of the turn of the wheel. I remember my old English teacher at school, I remember we studied King Lear. We spent about a year reading sort of every single line of King Lear. And he was talking about the end, about when Cordelia and King Lear are in prison. They've been captured, and King Lear says something like, "We two will sit like birds in the cage." You know, and finally, the beloved daughter has been restored to him. And that some later versions of King Lear ended the play there, because they wanted the redemptive ending. They wanted King Lear and his beloved daughter to just be happy in prison, sitting like birds in a cage. And then, of course, there's the final turn of the wheel. You know, things have got really, really bad. They've come up again. Lear and Cordelia reunited. And then Shakespeare just goes, turns the wheel one more. And Cordelia, who is a bit of a kind of wet drip, sort of Dickensian woman, isn't it? She gets sort of hung.
She's
and he
not
comes
a wet
back on.
drip.
Oh, no, I mean virtuous.
I don't believe I'm hearing this wet drip. What's that to say? Nothing. Nothing will come of nothing. Nothing. It's incredible wet drip.
No, okay, not wet. I take that back. Virtuous. She's a bit virtuous, isn't she? I mean, give me
good,
Reagan and Goneril any day, you know.
You should do what Denise says. Denise says absolutely unacceptable things 30 seconds before I have to stop.
And I think, you know, it's very interesting that later generations couldn't handle the ending in King Lear, and I think it's very telling, because Shakespeare's time could and did handle those endings. But then you get to, I mean, this is what's so fascinating about the Victorian period, you know, the huge poverty and then the moral hypocrisy, but also, as Toby was saying, the desire for sentimentality, the desire for something to sort of give us a kind of bulwark between us and reality. And I think it would be much harder to get away with that now.
Well, we want to hear a bit from your novel, and you, Stone Cradle. You said you described it as Dickensian. What do you?
Well, of course,
it's all right. You're allowed to do that.
No, I didn't think it was when I was writing it. I only thought it was when I was
mean?
Invited to this conference and looked at it.
It's become Dickensian.
It's become Dickensian. I mean, obviously, for a start, it's set in the 19th century, or a large part of it is set in the 19th century. A big chunk of it is set in the 1870s. And it's very closely based on my family history. And in fact, all the dates and the facts match my ancestors. And two of the main characters in it are my great-grandparents, my father's grandfather and grandmother.
Which are those?
That's Rose and Elijah.
Right.
And then Clementina is my great-great-grandmother. I had to change the names. The real names were fantastic, because my great-great-grandmother was a Romany woman. Her family nickname, her name was Caroline Lee, but her family nickname was Spank. I don't know why. But my father can remember her because she lived into the 90s, and she was very tiny, very dark-eyed, very fierce. He was absolutely petrified of her. The whole family was petrified of her. And she got pregnant with my great-grandfather at the age of 15 or 16 and gave birth to him in a graveyard, on a gravestone, in a village called Warrington outside Peterborough. And nobody knows who my great-grandfather's father was. He was called Tabletop on account of his flat head. And then you can see it's a real shame I couldn't use the real names because various members of my family would never have spoken to me again if I had. But when he met his own wife, when they were fruit picking on the Cambridgeshire farm, and his wife, the story I was told was his wife, Hepzibah, was a high-born lady, I was told, and that she was the landowner's daughter, and she would go collecting the rent from the gypsy caravans. And anyway, she took one look at my great-grandfather. They fell madly in love. They eloped. When her father found out she was consorting with gypsies, apparently he took all her clothes away, horsewhipped her and locked her in the bedroom. And she shinnied down the drainpipe and eloped with my great-grandfather. And her father and brothers set off on horseback to find them. And if they had found them, I would not be here today. But they didn't find them. And so these two young people, they went off to East Cambridge and they got married in a church. And she sent word back to the farm, to her family, that she was going to be legally wed because she wanted them to know. But none of the family showed up at the wedding. But without telling her, her father paid for the church bells to be rung as they came out of the church. Anyway, later, she said, quite often, I was told, it would have been better if one of the bells had fallen off and killed her stone dead, because she had such a miserable life with George, who was a great ne'er-do-well. And they didn't even have enough money for a Vardo, which is a gypsy caravan, and they were living in ditches on the side of the road. But it can't have been all bad, because they had 5 children together, one of whom was my father's mother. Tabletop George had this mother, Spank, a terrifying mother. And apparently when she first met Hepzibah, she said, "You've married my son and you'll sup sorrow by the spoonful till the day you die." Which you can say was not a great start to a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship. And what made me interested in this story is these 3 characters are all buried in a graveyard. So Tabletop, who was born in a graveyard, is buried in one, obviously, a different one in Peterborough. And poor old Hepzibah died in her 50s from stomach cancer, having had a very tough life. And her hated mother-in-law outlived her by 20 years. She didn't die until 1949. When his mother died, my great-grandfather opened up his wife's grave and put his mother on top. Now, this was probably done to save money because he was always broke and he was always drunk. So he probably couldn't afford another plot. But of course, this is such a fantastic metaphor. These 2 women hated each other for 30 years, and then they end up buried in the same grave. And you can go and visit the grave. I visited the grave with my father, and, you know, I stood by the grave and I thought, oh, I can feel a novel coming on. Let me lie down until it goes away. And what fascinated me is their grave there, it has both their names on, and we looked for Tabletop's grave, and it's a tiny little grave far away in the far corner, really hard to find. And it's like he's on his own over there, and these 2 women are locked together. And what it got me thinking was that both of these women have given up everything for the same man. You know, for Spank, you know, he was her only ever child, you know, her beloved boy, and then he runs off and marries a Gorgia, a non-Romany girl. For my great-grandmother, she had given up everything to elope with him, so she'd lost her own family. And by all accounts, this man was rather worthless. But these 2 women just invested everything. So it's a love triangle of sorts, even though it's a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. It's a kind of tussle for his affections. And so the novel actually ranges over nearly 100 years of their lives. But I think also that's a rather long answer to why it's Dickensian.
I would say it's Dickensian because of all the graveyards.
Well, lots of graveyards, references to ghosts.
Yeah, always a graveyard in a Dickens novel.
Minor novels, minor characters, I mean. Some coincidences as well, misunderstandings. I mean, how Dickensian is that? People believing that it's always one person. There's an incident where Rose Rose doesn't know who has paid for the church bells to be rung as she's come out of the church, and she gets it wrong. And decades later, she thanks the wrong man and causes him great pain by doing this. It's a complete misunderstanding. But this is one of the fascinating things, I suppose, about writing novels, is you're not consciously aware of any of this when you're doing it. You're just thinking, I'm going to tell the story about my great-grandparents' marriage. And then it's only later you go, oh, that's where I got that from.
You're going to read some of it?
I am. I'm going to read a short bit, which is, I chose because it's quite similar. It's Rose talking about how she was born, where she was raised. One of the great things about researching a family history is there's a huge habit of family history research in the UK. Do you have this in Germany as well? People get particularly obsessed who will tell you that they've traced their ancestors back to, Charles the whatever. And you get these charts where you fill in your parents, your grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, and then, of course, it gets broader and broader towards the end. And how many generations you can go back is a source of great pride.
That programme, it's just one of the top programmes, and where a celebrity goes back and finds out about their family history, and then the climax of the programme is always when they weep. They weep. Always they weep over, because you go back far enough and there's something bad, or something sad, or, something suitably Victorian about and they sit and they weep, and then the credits roll and you've had your...
Yeah.
And they call Dickens sentimental. I don't know. Go on.
Yeah. We've got this fantastic thing in London called the Family Records Centre, where they keep every record of birth, deaths and marriages. In the UK, every birth, death or marriage was legally supposed to have been recorded from 1837 onwards. So almost everybody can go back as far as 1837, which is quite a way back. But before 1837, you have to go to parish records in the churches. And the catch with researching a family history about Romanis or gypsies is that they quite often didn't register the children's birth, death, and marriage, because they were quite often trying to evade being registered in any way, shape, or form. But a lot of Romani families would have their children christened, because the parish would give gifts to itinerant families. So it was quite common for Roman families where there were 10 children. They would turn up at the vicar's door and they'd say, I've decided to bring my, small ones to God. And then they have all 10 children christened. They would get presents. And then they would probably go to the next parish and say, I've decided to bring my children to God. And then they would get another load of presents. And it was the way they clothed their families. My great-grandfather, he's in the parish records in Warrington. It says in the church records, gypsy boy born in the graveyard, in handwritten, little spiky handwriting, and that's in. When it came to researching the great-grandmother, I'd been told this story that she was a high-born lady, and when I looked into her background, her birth, marriage and death, she was nothing of the sort. She was the illegitimate daughter of an illiterate laundry maid called Emma Halfpenny, and she was born in the back streets of East Cambridge. And this is sort of about as Dickensian as you can get, really, because, of course, Cambridge, we all think of punting on the river and the backs and, the lords at their studies. But, of course, the university needed supported by a whole army of servants. And apparently it was very, very common for the laundry maids to get pregnant by the young gentlemen who were studying at Cambridge, because they would be going in and changing the bed sheets and all the rest of it. That particular great-great-grandmother was a laundry maid, and Emma, she got pregnant. Nobody knew who was my great-grandmother's father, so there's these two missing fathers in the story. But I tracked him down, because in her birth certificate, it's just blank for father, and it's mother, Emma Halfpenny. The registrar's written her name, and she's just put a cross. So that's how we know she was illiterate. And the father isn't named, but in one of the later certificates, Hepzibah Halfpenny, as she was then, or Hepzibah Smith, as she became, wrote down her father's name, and it was William something Sweep. And I went through, there's a telephone directory
for Cambridge in the 1870s, and I went through every street in the telephone directory, and 3 doors down from Emma Halfpenny, there was a William somebody sweep, and I thought, got you, you bastard. Nobody ever knew you fathered Emma Halfpenny's child, but I've got you, I found you. Anyway, I changed the story slightly. Rose in the novel, who is my great-grandmother in the novel, is born in an area of East Cambridge called the Garden of Eden, and it was called that because it was where all the fruits and veg allotments were to serve the university. And the streets, they're still called things like Paradise Street and of course,
Street, yeah.
Eden Street. And of course, they were very run-down, horrible tenements at the time, but the area was known as the Garden of Eden. My name is Rose Smith, and I was born on Paradise Street in East Cambridge. I wasn't a Smith when I was born, of course. I was Rose Blumpson. My mother was Emily Blumpson, laundry maid, and my father was nowhere in sight. I became a Smith when I married my husband, Elijah Smith, who I met when he came fruit picking at the orchards that belonged to my stepfather. That was later, of course. East Cambridge, the Garden of Eden, they called it. Lots of those streets south of Maid's Causeway had their own allotments back then, and the grocers and fruiterers had shops and warehouses nearby. Fruit and veg was big in that district. The traders round there supplied the colleges and all the posh folk. That was how the area got its name. The houses on Paradise Street didn't have anything fancy out back like allotments, just a yard and a privy. Paradise was south of Fitzroy Street, one of the new terraces they built not long after I was born on account of all the railway workers coming to town. The houses were neat enough, but they hadn't got the roads or pavements sorted out, and when I was a baby, my mother had to take me to lodgings on Prospect Row on account of the flooding and the sewerage problem. Great lumps of it would float down the road, apparently. We had a spell on Adam and Eve Street, then back to Paradise. My mother called me Rose because I was born in the Garden of Eden. She might as well have called me Carrot or Swede, to be perfectly honest, but as a child I liked to tell myself that I was born beautiful and perfect, like a flower in a garden. My mother was a simple woman, loving but simple. She was 16 years old when she had me, and unwed. It's a common enough story. So common, in fact, that I was inclined to embroider it when I was little. She was a college laundry maid, and I used to have lots of fancy thoughts about how my father was probably a lord or something. The young gentlemen at the colleges thought nothing of getting a handful of bastards along with their learning, after all. There's plenty a child runs along the poor, narrow back streets of East Cambridge with blue blood in its veins. Perhaps my father had a great mind to go with his great fortune, I used to think, and I would one day come across him on Jesus Lane with a book in his hand and a frown upon his brow. I imagined him as a noble young man with a head of fair curls. Maybe one day he would be out punting on the Cam, and I would fall in from the bank, and he would rescue me, and after one look at my face, he would embrace me as his own dear child. I would never have to turn a mangle handle again. I nagged my mother terribly to know who my father was, and my ideas were so fancy that I dare say she thought she had better disabuse me as soon as I was old enough to believe her. When I was about 6 or 7, she took me by the hand and marched me round the corner to Fitzroy Street, where there was a whole load of big shops, a fishmonger's and the shellfish shop, and a grocer's by the name of Rawson's. The Rawsons were a significant family round our way, owning quite a few places and renting out allotments in return for produce. We stood across the road, my mother and I, holding hands. It was a busy morning and there was a lot of pony and cart traffic going to and fro, but we could see Rawsons well enough. Boxes were stacked up high upon the slope outside. They'd just had a load of new cabbages in, the pretty ones with the dark, crumply leaves, and they'd been arranged nicely in the boxes, so they blossomed out as if begging you to buy them. Apples gleamed in piles on the other side. I can still picture it. It was riches to me then. Through the window I could see Mr. Rawson, a large fellow with a belly to match, a drooping moustache and no hair on his head. He was patting butter on a slab. One of his sons was helping out behind the counter, folding a fold of blue paper and flipping it over to make a bag. "That's your father, so are you happy now?" my mother said. "What? The young fella?" I said, a little confused, as he was married not the week before, and we'd all gone out onto the street to see him bring his wife back on the cart belonging to the Orchard Tavern, pulled by two beautiful greys. "No," she said, "not him. The old fella, Mr. George Rawson. He got me with you, and he hasn't spoken to me since, nor will he ever. And if you were to go in there right now and call him Dad, he'd chase you out of his shop with a big stick. But I reckon most folk round here know it, and you should know it too." Well, this was something large to squeeze into my small head. George Rawson, my father. But he was big and fat, with 4 grown-up sons and his wife still living, and they all had houses in the streets round ours, and we must pass one or another of them in the street every day, though we had no need to go into their shop, as there was a little fruiterer's just at the end of Paradise owned by a man called Empers. When you're that age, you just accept what you're told. And although in truth I was mightily disappointed that my father was not a lord with a noble brain, I can't remember feeling much about it, except just an oddness in my stomach if I saw one of the Rawson family around. You could say that fruit and vegetables played an overly significant part in my early days. Apples, potatoes, cherries and the like. That was how I ended up with a stepfather.
Another story that makes me think that a great deal of fiction would have been impossible if DNA matching had existed, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Most Shakespeare plays and the whole lot would go down the pan. I think is it all right if we go straight to questions?
Yes, of course.
I think we started a little bit late. So anybody here have we got the mics ready? Anybody here who'd like to say anything or ask anything? Yes, madam. Oh, wait, the mic's just coming.
I was just wondering, you researched your family history very meticulously. And I was wondering, did you find any other sources than from the archives, like letters or, legends going down the family line, etc.? Because most of it then, in the end, is invention. But were there any other sources?
No, there were no letters because most of my family were illiterate, so that cut that one out. There were a surprising number of photographs. I have a photograph of Spank, even though she was born in the 1850s, and born in a caravan on the side of the road, so the chances of such a woman being photographed statistically are probably quite small. But because she lived to 1949, there are several photographs of her in her old age. It's photographs of both of my great-grandparents. And physically, they're very similar to how they were described in the book. But I did have a fantastic aunt, my father's cousin, my Aunt Betty, who sadly died now. But she was the kind of, everyone needs one elderly relative who talks, don't they? You just need one. Because once one talks, then the others that don't want to talk will say something to contradict them. So my Aunt Betty, we would go over to Aunt Betty's house. She grew up in the same house as her mother, my great-aunt Lenda, and her Auntie Marion. They all grew up in this big crumbling house in Peterborough. Auntie Betty and Auntie Marion both married Ukrainians who came over as displaced persons after the war to the UK. So there would be all these kind of sort of huge teas with sort of food on the table, and Aunt Lenda talking in Anglo-Roman to Auntie Betty, and Uncle Nicky talking to Uncle Walter in Ukrainian. It was all very sort of mad and shouty, and Auntie Betty was the one who would sort of tell the family stories. She was the one who told me about our great-grandmother saying to her daughter-in-law, "You've married my son, and you'll sup sorrow spoonful till the day you die." And there were loads of stories like that. I mean, basically what I say is anything good in Stone Cradle, I didn't make it up, I nicked it from the family stories. So oral storytelling more than letters.
Was it tricky finding enough distance from your characters? Because that's, when you're writing about autobiographical elements, it can happen, I think, that you get so involved in that it's actually difficult to get enough distance from your characters in order to write about them.
Well, it's obviously, it's easier when you're doing a historical story. I mean, distance was much harder to achieve in Whatever You Love, because there's a child in it who dies who's the same age as my children. And obviously because it's a contemporary story and a first-person woman's narrative. I mean, the Stone Cradle has 2 first-person narratives that interweave. And I think it's something, again, that we'll be talking about in the workshop this afternoon, is there is a particular problem with the first person, which is how you make the voice distinct from your own. And particularly if you're using more than one first-person narrative, how you make the voices sound different from each other, and how you give them tonal variety. And that is one of the issues. I mean, I think, you know, when you read David Copperfield and Great Expectations, he, even though, you know, Pip is in many ways a more snobby and less likeable character than David Copperfield, you can still hear Dickens's voice. You know, the more you know about Dickens, the more that's true. And I think that's just one of the unavoidable hazards of the first person. But it's also one of the benefits, I think.
Yes.
I was amazed by the passage that you read from David Copperfield at how linguistically complicated it is. I mean, there's lots of complicated syntax, whereas the passage you just read out was much, you know, simpler in the sense of a speaking voice. Is that because we can't handle Victorian syntax anymore, or because you were looking for something more authentic?
Well, it's interesting you should raise that, because I was aware of doing that reading, is that there was that long sentence where I nearly lost breath by the end of the sentence with all those subordinate clauses. I think it's a combination of factors. I think it's partly that Dickens, I mean, David Copperfield, although it's narrated from a child's point of view, it's narrated from the point of view of a man who will grow up, who will become a journalist, and so he's using the language of the adult David. And I think, I mean, I suppose Rose in the novel, although she grows up, she never becomes anything more than what she was born to be. You know, she ends up living in, you know, ditches on the side of the road and bender tents, and eventually persuades George to move into a house, but she's never anything other than a woman at home living in very poverty-stricken circumstances. So I couldn't have given her a narrative tone that sounded educated and complex. This was a woman who had no education throughout her whole life. So to have given her a sophisticated narrative would have sounded very peculiar. Which doesn't, I suppose, it doesn't mean that you can't use long sentences. But yes, there was a reason why I kept it simple, because I kept it in the language that the adult Rose would have used. Whereas, obviously, if you have a character that goes on to become something more educated and then narrates the child's point of view from their adult perspective, you have the luxury of using a different tone of voice.
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting, perhaps slightly pessimistic point that Cordelia makes, that we've been talking a lot about Dickens as a great populist, but you take a chunk of Dickens' narrative. I mean, the dialogue is often, you know, written in a very different way, but take a chunk of narrative from almost any of the books, and you think, my goodness, you know, there are people not at the bottom of the social spectrum, but there are a lot of what we would think of as kind of artisan class or lower middle class people are reading this and buying it in thousands, and it's really quite demanding, you know, and too tough for A-level, too tough for sixth formers in England, too hard. The sentences, the words. I mean, you know, there is a kind of line, oh my goodness, you know, what a falling off there's been.
A lot of those people would have had it read aloud to them. And I think that makes a huge difference. If you're listening to somebody, you know, there might be one person in a family who is literate who would be reading the Dickens serial to 15 other people. And then you have the mediation of someone's performance come. So I don't think it's quite as pessimistic as you think.
Well, perhaps it's a remarkable, perhaps the other way around, not we're all stupid, but it says something rather extraordinary about what it was like, what it could be like to, you know, like, I mean, there are other periods, you know, people, quite ordinary people, apprentices, used to watch Hamlet and they didn't even know the story first, you know, and please, sir.
When you talked about your last novel, you mentioned a child's death, which, of course, rings a Dickensian bell, but the novel will not be Dickensian. Can you tell us more about the novel, about the last novel?
Okay, the most recent one, the one that's come out. Yeah, did I say that? It's not Dickensian. Yes, it's not Dickensian. That's right. It's set in contemporary UK in a small seaside town, and it's interesting. There's a fantastic quote from Zadie Smith, which is, "You write each novel to correct the failings of the previous one." And I think when I was writing Whatever You Love, I obviously had in mind what I'd done with Stone Cradle, and I knew I wanted to do something different. And I realised that one of the things I had never done is start a novel, if you like, with a bang, with a big set piece. And it's something that a lot of novelists do. I mean, Ian McEwan is the obvious example. If you think of the ballooning accident at the beginning of Enduring Love. And there's an interesting argument about, whether or not his novels sometimes don't follow through.
Child in Time's even better, I think.
Yeah,
the child getting lost in the soup.
that is. I do photocopy that to show to students actually how just
sort of
gripping
unreadably readable.
Yeah.
I mean, it's.
So I thought, right, almost as an exercise, I thought, right, I'm going to start a novel with a set-piece scene. And obviously I thought of the worst thing I could imagine, which is the police coming to your door to tell you that your child has been killed in a road accident. I mean, to me, that is just the worst thing that anyone can imagine. And then just to follow through the consequences of that. And Whatever You Love, it's not really a novel about bereavement. It's actually a novel about revenge. It's about the mother's desire to track down the driver of the car and get her revenge. And that's why it's called Whatever You Love, because she swears to get her revenge not by killing him, but by finding out what he loves and taking it away from him in the same way he has from her. And I had the problem I was talking about earlier. You can't make it too grim, you can't make it too readable, but you still want it unreadable, but you want it to be realistic. So what I have is there are flashback scenes to her marriage. And she has had this whirlwind romance, very passionate romance, with the father of her children. They've married, they've had children. And then he has left her for another woman. And this story surfaces in the present-day story, and it becomes apparent after a while that the real revenge she's after is not just against the driver of the car that killed her daughter, it's against her ex-husband and his new partner. And it's like all the demons are coming out of the woodwork. And it's really the story of a very sort of ostensibly ordinary woman put in a situation of extremis. And then the idea is, at the beginning of the novel, you feel an automatic sympathy for her because this appalling thing has happened. And then as her behaviour becomes more and more extreme, you're forced to address what would you do in those circumstances, and are you capable of behaving like that? And I mean, I have absolutely no doubt I'm completely capable of behaving like that. Towards the end of the book, she does something, let's just say, very transgressive. Have you got to that? Have you read?
No,
what
I
have
haven't.
You
It sounds
there
good.
Is a scene, there's a scene towards the end where she does something that a lot of readers balk at. I have to tell you, in the UK, I've had people come up to me at festivals and saying, I was right with her until she did that.
She's piquing your fancy.
And we did actually have a very serious discussion with my editor in the UK about whether or not to leave it in, because it's something that will revolt a lot of readers. And would you go that far? Would you do it or wouldn't you?
Revolt?
My German translator, Astrid, is here, so she can maybe comment from the podium. I don't know. I wonder whether it's a cultural thing. I don't know whether it will be as upsetting for German readers as it would be for some UK readers. I don't know. That remains to be seen.
Sir, I think this will have to be the last question, I'm afraid. Please, sir. There's a mic just behind you.
Thank you. Can I just return to the point of the Dickens's language and his audience? The audience Dickens was writing for, wasn't there a literary culture among those people? They read the Bible. They read books like Bunyan, for example. So would his large popular audience, wouldn't that audience be different from large popular audiences today, who in many cases have no literary background like those audiences in the 19th century did have, by reading the Bible, reading Bunyan, reading whatever, Dr. Johnson, Rasselas, books like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't really know the answer to that particularly, but I mean, I think it's certainly true that that, I mean, obviously there weren't many other, as it were, media to go on, and therefore as Louise says, even those who perhaps didn't read it were used to being read to. We're used to hearing even newspapers read to them, and would expect lots of the things that were read to them to adopt an educated vocabulary, because that's what you went to these sources for doing, to do. And one imagines that people who sort of wrote for newspapers did not particularly agonize, as somebody writing for a newspaper would do now, about we've got to make it comprehensible. You've got to cut it down and make it. You derived your authority from the educated elaborateness of your sentences in your vocabulary. So I think actually by the 19th century, he hazards a guess, but I think by the mid-19th century, things like the press were much more influential on not as it were the labouring classes, but the classes just above them were much more influenced in their expectation of what the English language was like by the press than actually necessarily by the Bible or Bunyan, which formed the expectations of those listening to the first novels 100 years earlier. I mean, they did still have the Bible, of course, but they also had an explosion of other kinds of print, I think.
Is it the John Carey book, Language and the Masses? Is it Language?
It's
is that John Carey?
No. Yes, it is, John.
Culture,
it's not called Language and the Masses.
I mean, he's got a sort of very interesting theory that as you got the rise of mass literacy, that's when literature, I think, retreated into sort of modernism and experimenting and sort of obscurantism, as the masses became able to read novels for themselves. That's when you got this sudden division between sort of high art and popular culture. And but I would be fascinated. Again, I'm sure someone's done it, to actually see a breakdown of the literacy levels of Dickens' consumers. To what extent was it the literate classes? To what extent was it also being read to people who would never read anything else?
Still, most of his readers were what we would call middle class, albeit relatively modest of them. But they weren't. Joe the crossing sweeper wouldn't be reading it. And I mean, and in Dickens's own day, of course, as now, lots of the knowledge of the stories and characters didn't come from actually reading the books. But the story about the Barrow girl, who, this story, you must know this story, the Barrow girl on Dickens's death, whom Forster, I think, heard saying, she was told, the girl selling old clothes on a barrow in the street in London, Dickens has died. And she said, Dickens has died. Have they killed Father Christmas too? and that sort of, he had a play, and that was an illiterate girl, totally illiterate.
Well,
she wouldn't necessarily been hearing his stories read aloud.
There's a wonderful counter story to that, to wrap up on writers and their egos. When George Bernard Shaw went to the Soviet Union, they were obviously very keen that this great thinker should, come down on the side of the communism and the Soviet Union. And so they primed things like ticket attendants on the train to go up to him and say, oh, sir, I did love your, whatever. And he went home with this idea that, gosh, even ticket attendants on trains, and this is how wonderful the Soviet system is, how fantastic they are, and came back and wrote these great sort of, and they had done it deliberately. If you ever want to hide anything from someone, hide it in their ego, because he fell for it completely.
Right. Well, we end with a precept, as ever. And we have a little coffee break now, and just thank Louise very much for talking to us.